Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video and talk about this subject that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video by that of AKHi TV, who I like to review quite a lot because AKHi TV, once again, even though, of course, I disagree with a lot of his points, he always brings certain points that, in my personal view, are somewhat important to talk about, at least when it comes to that of the boxing sphere. Especially when it comes to some of his political reasonings, in my personal view. But I mean, we'll talk about that here in a bit. But of course, for those of you that ended up seeing the most recent great pay per view card, and it was a great pay per view card, there was a multitude of great fights on this card, from great featherweight fights with the Argentine fighter fighting that one Mexican fighter, to Brandon Figueroa versus Steve Van Fulton, to Jesus Ramos versus Jason Rosario, of course, to Isaac Pitbull Cruz fighting Fierro, or whoever that one fighter's name was, and of course to the main event, Mr. David Benavidez versus David Morrell, the Battle of the Davids. And of course, for those of you that did not end up seeing this fight, David Benavidez, also known as El Monstro, or the Mexican Monster, he was able to pull out a unanimous decision, a well-deserved unanimous decision, over that of David Morrell, which is pretty much what I ended up predicting, because for any of us that really knew what we were watching from that of both fighters, just in my personal view, there's a certain amount of people that were really surprised about how this fight turned out, or some people that were surprised about this fight and how it turned out, like an AKHi TV. And you're going to tell overall from an AKHi TV that he expected this fight to go much differently. And I think that he predicted David Morrell in order to win this fight. And once again, you had so many of these people that were stating that, oh, well, David Morrell, he's going to be the quicker footed fighter. He's going to be better defensively. He's going to be slicker. He's going to have better head movement, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, most people, when it comes to a boxing fight, but not just boxing fights, but when it comes to a lot of things in life, but especially athletes, or a great battle, or a one-on-one situation, or a team v team, basically just sports in general, they don't judge them off of their actual boxing character, or off of their actual character, or their all-around skill set in terms of depth. They pretty much make a surface level comparison and go off of their caricature, or their caricature, pretty much, what they believe they're, supposed to be. That's why you have certain people out here saying that Terrence Bud Crawford, that, he clearly is, the best defensive fighter of his era. Although for any of us that actually watch Terrence Bud Crawford, we know that he's a relatively good defensive fighter, but he's not someone that is immaculate defensively. He can be hit. When you take a look at certain people, when they take a look at someone like an Alexander Usyk, they may say that, he doesn't know how to fight going backwards, or, something like that of a sort, even though Alexander Usyk, he can pretty much fight within any range. And then when you talk about this particular fight, of course, you have certain people that state that, well, David Benavidez is going to be the straightforward, come forward fighter. He can't really do anything else other than pressure within this fight. And David Morrell is going to be the slick boxer in this fight that's going to be on the back foot. And I stated that pretty much heading into this fight, I did not see that. I did not see a fighter in David Morrell, at least from what I had seen from him in the past of his professional fights. I did not see this quote unquote Araceli Lara or Guillermo Rigondeaux type of boxer. He's not that type of boxer. What he mainly is that he's a guy that is mostly comfortable on that of the front foot. Now, will there be times where maybe he tries to set you up with a punch on the back foot? At times, or within the mid-range. But to be honest with you, David Morrell, when you talk about his quote-unquote boxing character, his boxing character and his depth of character, at least when you talk about his actual boxing ability, was really massively overrated heading into this fight. Whereas David Benavidez, his boxing character and his boxing ability was underrated heading into this fight. All basically because many people took a look at this fight and said, I've seen this situation many times before, so it's going to transpire pretty much the same way. And you can't always take a look at things in that particular way. You have to take a look at someone for what they actually are in terms of the depth of character. And many people did not really realize the skill set, or the all-around skill set, that a David Benavidez had, and also did not realize the all-around skill set that a David Morrell had. And David Morrell is not as skilled of a fighter as a David Benavidez. And really, to be quite honest with you, David Morrell, I'm not really quite sure if he's an all-around skilled fighter as a Caleb Plant or a Demetrius Andrade. But, it is what it is. That'll be somewhat proven within time. But I need to see more, to kind of go that far. But we'll see. But anyways, AKHi TV, what you're going to realize once again about in this video is that AKHi TV, that he judges a lot of certain things off of stereotypes and caricatures, not off of actual depth and not off of a super deep, in-depth analyzation about something that is actually based in reality. But let's see what AKHi TV has to say. Let's get into it.
Congratulations to David Benavidez as he keeps climbing up the pound-for-pound ladder. I already had him as number 8 on my pound-for-pound list. But with this huge win tonight, Benavidez keeps rising on the pound-for-pound list. Morrell, on the other hand,
David Benavidez would have not been on my pound-for-pound list prior to this fight, but now that David Benavidez is a legit two-weight division champion, and he now has at least 3 A-grade level wins under his belt, including Caleb Plant, Demetrius Andrade, and David Morrell, he would definitely have a great debate as being a top 10 level pound-for-pound fighter on my list. I'm not really quite sure who would exactly make up my top 10 pound-for-pound list at the moment, which is also part of the reason why I did not do one this year when regularly I do one, because it was just going to be a little bit difficult because there were so many changings. Like I had Teofimo Lopez, I believe, on my top 10 pound-for-pound list last year, but I'm not really 100% sure if I would still include him on there. Gervonta Tank Davis, of course, is somewhat on there, but it's a little bit hard to rank where he is. Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, of course, I don't know really where to rank him anymore because he's no longer a champion, and technically he's still undefeated, but of course he did not look very good against Ryan Garcia. So it was just, it was a little bit of a shakeup this year, and I'm not really quite sure who all exactly is on my top 10 pound-for-pound list. Now, the fighters that I know for certain are on my top 10 pound-for-pound list are guys like Usyk, Crawford, Naoya Inoue, Canelo Alvarez, Artur Beterbiev, certain guys like that. Dimitri Bivol, I'm not really quite sure if he'd be on my top 10 pound-for-pound list anymore because usually one of the criteria for my list is that you have to have a belt in order to be on my top 10 pound-for-pound list. But to be fair, Dimitri Bivol, he did fight, one of the most dominant fighters and, one of the most, greater fighters, or one of the greater fighters probably of the past 10 plus years in Artur Beterbiev. So, I mean, maybe he could still be on there. But, Dimitri Bivol, it's not like he's done much more other than win one belt in his career. To be fair, he has gotten a couple of very good wins, like over Canelo and Gilberto Soto Ramirez and John Pascal and Joe Smith Jr., but I think that Artur Beterbiev, that he clearly has a more extensive resume, and I think that he's just done more. So I don't really know where Dimitri Bivol would be on my list. But, that's why I did not really put a top 10 pound-for-pound list out this year. But I'd have to really, rank, just in terms of, of my criteria, where David Benavidez would be. But he's certainly top 20 pound-for-pound right now, at the least in my personal view, finally. And he could be top 10 pound-for-pound if you wanted to debate it. You could debate it.
he showed that he has an iron chin. However, he completely fought the wrong fight. From the first round, he was standing in front of Benavidez, and it was actually Benavidez who was outboxing Morrell. And he showed that he had...
Yes, it was, and that's pretty much what I had predicted. For those of you, once again, that had seen my fight prediction, you know that I had said that David Benavidez, in my view, that he actually, in my view, is the all-around more skilled fighter, that he's more defensively responsible, that he has a better jab, that he's someone that, in my view, that even though David Morrell gets credit for all this great footwork and stuff like that, that he really doesn't have any of that. Now, that's not me stating that he's not talented, but people thought that heading into this fight that this was going to be like an Araceli Lara versus Canelo Alvarez match or something like that. And I just didn't see that happening because David Morrell is not the boxer of what Araceli Lara was. He's just not. He doesn't really have a great counter jab over the top or a great range-finding jab like what Araceli Lara did. He does not have the feet nor the footwork of Araceli Lara. He does not really have the ability to set up traps within the mid-range, nor the back foot range when you talk about it the way a Guillermo Rigondeaux or an Araceli Lara did. He just didn't. David Morrell is a guy that, in my view, he's, somewhat okay within some of the other ranges, but he's mainly a come-forward fighter. That's mainly what he is. He's not a super great defensive fighter. He doesn't have the best of feet in the world, at least when you talked about the way that people were talking about him. But once again, that just goes to show you that many people who analyze boxing or analyze a sport in particular, they don't really know what the hell they're talking about. They just pretty much go off of, once again, caricatures. They don't go off of the actual depth of character or skill set. Once again, it's kind of like in basketball. Like, people take a look at Steph Curry, for example, and they say, oh, Steph Curry is a great all-time three-point shooter. Like, that's what he brought to the game. Steph Curry, one of his most biggest impacts, of course, is his three-point shooting, but he also has much more than that. That's why he's a two-time MVP and someone that has led the Golden State Warriors to 4 championships, and on top of that, led them to 67 plus wins for about 3 or 4 different consecutive seasons. So, I mean, 3 different seasons. You can't just be a great three-point shooter or a great sniper and be an all-time great level NBA player like what a Steph Curry is. Steph Curry, once again, has excellent ball handling ability and dexterity in his hands and great hand-eye coordination. He's a guy that is actually decent defensively at his best, even though many people will not have you believe that. He's a guy overall that is extraordinarily quick and has great stamina. He's a guy that is, playing very well off of picks. He plays very well off the ball. He's a guy that actually penetrates to the basket extraordinarily well. He rebounds exceptionally well for his size. He's a very decent passer, although not an exceptional one, but a very decent passer. Many people, once again, they take a look at somebody on the surface level mainly, and then they want to judge them off of that. That's a big part of the reason why certain people were surprised at how this fight ended up turning out. But I was not surprised because, once again, when I took a look at David Benavidez and David Morrell, I knew that David Benavidez, that there were certain things that he did better than what David Morrell did.
The better defense than Morrell, especially in the pocket. I told you guys leading up to the fight, whoever fights his fight and execute the game plan is going to win the fight. If we knew that...
Yes, that's usually how sports work, AKHi TV. Whoever implements their game plan usually better does usually end up winning the fight. However, David Morrell, I'm not really quite sure 100% what the game plan was in this fight, because you did have to kind of set up traps against that of a David Benavidez, but, once again, I just don't think that he has that ability. And for those of you that, remember the UFC, or, for those of you that that go this far back, or ever watched UFC, Daniel Cormier had a great quote when he ended up fighting against Anthony Rumble Johnson in the rematch. And Anthony Rumble Johnson, he was known as a significantly dangerous striker. He was a guy that was known to where pretty much he had the touch of death, as certain people would say, in both hands. He was a guy that could pretty much knock you out with either punch, But in the first fight, of course, Anthony Rumble Johnson, he ended up getting submitted by that of a DC, Daniel Cormier. And then in the rematch, Anthony Rumble Johnson, he ended up wrestling with that of a Daniel Cormier. And Anthony Rumble Johnson ended up wrestling with him, and a lot of people were like, why the hell was Anthony Rumble Johnson wrestling with a Daniel Cormier? Someone that's a bit stockier and a little bit bigger than him, and someone that is known as an expert wrestler. Why the hell would he do that? Well, it's because Daniel Cormier is also a great striker, and Daniel Cormier is a greater all-around fighter than that of an Anthony Rumble Johnson. But Daniel Cormier ended up saying something that, in my view, is actually very true to a lot of human psychology, and not just human psychology, but a lot of nature in general. And what he stated is that when certain people are uncomfortable, or when certain people once again, are put in very tough situations, they always end up usually resorting to what makes them comfortable or what they believe that they're best at. And Anthony Rumble Johnson, even though, of course, he eventually became a striker, he first was known as a wrestler. He had a wrestling background. So I knew that eventually he was going to try to wrestle with me because that's what he's looked at as his backbone. And David Morrell, when you talk about, once again, his backbone of fighting, his main style of fighting is not setting up traps on the back foot. It's mainly coming forward and trying to set you up and break you down. And I just don't know if David Morrell has the ability to beat David Benavidez in that type of way.
Morrell was going to stand in
And obviously he didn't, because David Benavidez, of course, was able to clearly outbox him.
front of Benavidez, then without a doubt, this wouldn't have been a 50-50 fight. I don't know what Morrell was thinking, fighting Benavidez.
What Morrell was thinking is that he basically had no other way. Just as DC Daniel Cormier said against Anthony Rumble Johnson, when people get uncomfortable, they resort to basically what they know. That's why when certain people, when they take a look at a fighter like a Deontay Wilder or an Adrian Broner, like when Wilder had fought a Tyson Fury, they said, well, why doesn't Deontay Wilder, instead of just going for the right hand the whole entire time, why doesn't he throw shots to the body? Why doesn't he do this? Why doesn't he do that? Or if Adrian Broner, if he wants to be successful, he needs to throw more punches. Why doesn't he lead with the jab a little bit more? Why doesn't he do that? Because that's not who those fighters are. Those fighters are guys to where when you talk about being in tough situations, and them being at their most comfortable, Deontay Wilder's answer is to land that right hand and basically try to, knock you out overall with his Suzy Q right hand. That's basically what his answer is. That has mainly been his answer in tough situations. Adrian Broner, in certain tough situations, he kind of, ends up being a little bit reclusive and kind of turning back into a shell, and basically he wants you to kind of stand in front of him so he can get his work off. But if not, he doesn't really have an answer to that. So people, once again, when they are in tough situations or adverse situations, a lot of the times, at least most people, they end up resorting back to what they're comfortable with. It takes an expert level athlete or an expert level boxer to really adjust in excellent situations or in adverse situations like that. And that's what separates certain athletes from that of the Tom Brady's or the Novak Djokovic's or the Michael Jordans, or for boxing, the Crawfords, the Canelos, the Usyks, from that is someone like a David Morrell or an Adrian Broner or a Deontay Wilder. Someone that, although may be somewhat great within their own right, they're never going to be looked at on the same level as some of the best ever.
Like that. And interestingly enough, it was actually Morrell who won the later rounds instead of Benavidez. A lot of people were under the impression Benavidez was gonna.
Well, David Morrell won the 10th or the 11th round, whichever round he ended up getting the knockdown in. But other than that, I didn't really think David Morrell won that many rounds. Like I said, I've seen a whole bunch of people claim that this was quote-unquote fight of the year and that, this was one of the greatest fights they had ever seen. I mean, I thought it was an okay fight, but in my personal view, had David Benavidez had a better gas tank, I think that they would have stopped David Morrell. I think that it was a good little fight, but all in all, did I think that this was a fight to where both combatants were evenly mastered, evenly skilled? No. I think David Morrell was debatably the better athlete compared to David Benavidez, at least when you talk about size and strength. But when you talk about all-around skill set or what they brought to the table, they weren't really that similarly matched. And that's why David Benavidez, in my view, won this fight about 9 rounds to 3 or 8 rounds to 4.
Come on stronger in the later rounds. Well, actually, it was the opposite. Morrell won the later rounds, and he actually managed to knock down Benavidez in the 11th round. Morrell showed a lot of heart. On the other hand, Benavidez showed a lot of IQ. He was the one with the better defense, and he was the one who made the adjustments better.
Which is the same thing that I said heading into this fight.
Benavidez countered better, and he set up his offense way better than Morrell. It was actually Benavidez, the boxer, in there. In this fight, the hand speed of Benavidez was his main advantage, or one of his main advantages.
Well, David Benavidez had a plenty of advantages in this fight. The advantages that David Morrell had were his his arm reach, and of course, his punching power. That probably was the advantage, but other than that, he didn't really have any other advantage. I mean, probably maybe a little bit of his size, but of course they're comparable somewhat in size. But pretty much every other category, David Benavidez had the edge in. David Benavidez had the edge in hand speed. He had the edge in defense. He had the edge in a jab. He had the edge overall within the mid-range. He had the edge somewhat within the inside. There wasn't really any particular advantage, at least a multitude of advantages that David Morrell really was going to have over David Benavidez. People thought heading into this fight that David Morrell was going to have the feet advantage and that he was going to have the defensive advantage and that he was going to have all these other advantages. And I told people that's not the fighter that David Morrell is.
He utilized it completely against Morrell. However, Morrell, on the other hand, his footwork, the angles, him circling left and right, that was supposed to be the main advantage he had against Benavidez, since
it was supposed to be the main advantage that he had over David Benavidez if he was an Araceli Lara, but he's not. That's why I say AKHi TV heading into this fight, he had no idea who David Morrell actually was.
Benavidez is supposed to be flat-footed. Well, for some reason, Morrell...
You see what AKHi TV said there? He said that David Benavidez, that he's supposed to be flat-footed. So what is AKHi TV basically stating there? He's saying that this fight surprised me a little bit because David Benavidez, what I expected of him, because I've seen this, situation before, he ended up, being different than what I thought. And that's a part of the reason why David Benavidez, in my personal view, why this win also meant a certain amount to him. Not just because he's now an official two-time, division champion, and it was a great win over, a very dangerous contender at this moment in time, but talking about, caricatures or, trying to break out of certain stereotypes or, out of certain images. David Benavidez has really been trying to escape a certain image for his whole entire career, or basically his whole entire life. For those of you, of course, that remember David Benavidez when he was younger, David Benavidez, of course, was looked at as, someone of the fat, chubby kid that would be easy to pick on. And David Benavidez, I believe, has kind of had a little bit of that chip on his shoulder to where he believes that he kind of has to get that moniker off of him. Now, I think that David Benavidez knows how to use that to his advantage to a certain degree. And that's why I believe that why David Morrell was somewhat under his skin. Because David Benavidez, I think that this fight reminded him somewhat of his childhood when he would get made fun of or when he would get bullied because he was the quote-unquote fat or the chubby kid, and they thought that maybe he wouldn't be anything, greater than what they just seen on the surface. And David Benavidez is still somewhat dealing with that to a certain degree to this day. Basically where people take a look at him and don't look at him as any more than just a straightforward one-dimensional Mexican fighter. And I have to admit, even myself, even a few years ago, that I didn't really see much more than that out of David Benavidez. But it's clear that even though, of course, he has flaws, he's more, is more is to David Benavidez than what most people would see on the surface.
Fought flat-footed, and it was Benavidez, the one who was jumping back and making Morrell pay at times. From round one, Morrell did not utilize his feet, and when he started moving around in the middle rounds, he started having success, which that was Morrell's biggest downfall, is standing right in front of Benavidez. He kept his head in the center line.
What did I say about David Morrell heading into this fight? I said that David Morrell, that he has nowhere near as good a defense, nowhere near as good as head movement as what people try to claim that he does. His head can be very centered and it can be fight very, very tall. He does not have excellent head movement. He does not have excellent feet. He does not have excellent defense. He does not have any of those categories. It is what it is. Like I said, people thought that David Morrell was going to be another Araceli Lara. He does not have the boxing ability of an Araceli Lara. He does not.
Benavidez kept finding him time and time again with his straight right hand and with his jab. In fact, Benavidez landed more jabs than Morrell. The main thing Morrell kept,
which is also another thing that I said heading into this fight,
which if you didn't know any better, you will think Morrell was exchanging with Benavidez. However, it was more so him timing Benavidez. Whenever Benavidez threw a shot, he tried to time it and throw his own shot at the same time. He will move his head and throw his own overhand left. However, Benavidez started avoiding that. But every now and then, Morrell will catch Benavidez and earn his respect. That's why Benavidez had to watch out. Remember, he got dropped in the 11th round. But that wasn't enough, though. By that time, Morrell needed a KO, which that's what he was searching for. Since Benavidez, he already had the fight in the bag by that point. That being said, congratulations to Benavidez for keep defeating the odds. Highly impressed by Benavidez. He truly is the Mexican monster. You will think Canelo is Irish. The way Benavidez moves, he's a true, real warrior. Throwback, old school Mexican warrior. This ain't none of that Canelo Alvarez duck sauce. No duck and no life. Top motto. You got.
And of course, in regular AKHi TV and Dante's Boxing Nation type fashion, they can't go one video without mentioning Canelo Alvarez. But listen, what I'll state is this. Canelo is going to have to somewhat deal with that criticism, at least at that point in time in his career. He had the opportunity to at least really try harder to make the David Benavidez fight, and he didn't really try to make that fight all that much. And on top of that, his level of competition has kind of dropped off a little bit more as of lately. Even though I think that Jamel Charlo and Jaime Munguia were still A- level wins, debatably. But, at the end of the day, once again, David Benavidez was the fight that everybody wanted to see. Canelo's going to have to deal with that criticism. Is what it is.
See why Canelo keeps avoiding Benavidez is due to the obvious fact. Canelo knows he will never be the same if he fights Benavidez.
And I agree with that. He probably would not be the same fighter ever again after David Benavidez, and Canelo's not really the same fighter again now. Canelo pretty much is an older fighter. He's a guy that, he's getting very close to retirement. And I think that Canelo Alvarez himself realizes that. David Benavidez, in my personal view, he's just a little bit too big for Canelo Alvarez. And on top of that, right now, just a little bit too fresh for someone like a Canelo. Canelo is a guy that clearly is aging as a fighter. And I think that he only really has about one or two big fights left in him. Really about one big fight left. And I think the Crawford fight, even though at first I was not a super huge supporter of the fight, I think that it pretty much is the best fight possible, at least for Canelo Alvarez at this current moment in time. And then if he beats Crawford, of course, then potentially he can fight, maybe, if he wants to add that onto his legacy, the unified winner at light heavyweight. If, of course, he's able to get past Crawford, which I assume more than likely that he'll be able to, if it's still a good version of Canelo. We'll see what ends up happening there. But, as AKHi TV said, good on David Benavidez for defying the odds. He didn't really defy the odds in my personal view because I know what David Benavidez is. He's a guy that, yes, he has, a few flaws in his style. But he's, when you take a look at his boxing style, even though, once again, he leaves a little bit left to be desired in certain skill sets, he kind of shuffles his feet at certain times. Sometimes he's a little bit too high and centered. Sometimes he kind of leans back and fights a little bit too tall. He doesn't always have the best of feet. But David Benavidez, there's more to him than what meets the eye, at least when you talk about a lot of, the skill sets that people try to say that he just has. David Benavidez has more skills than what certain people give him credit for. He didn't really defy the odds for me because I favored him in all three of the Caleb Plant, Demetrius Andrade, and David Morrell fights. But at the end of the day, David Benavidez, for those people that, think David Benavidez is this certain type of boxer, good on him for defying the odds.
Morrell, on the other hand, he needs to keep his head up and come back better than ever. I truly believe this is going to make Morrell a better fighter. This is a valuable lesson to use the IQ.
And you notice that AKHi TV tells David Morrell to keep his quote-unquote head up and that he can use this as an experience and blah, blah, blah. Notice once again, whenever it comes to a black fighter that they support, that that he needs to keep his head up and that overall there's nothing wrong with the loss. But whenever it comes to a fighter that they need to tear down, then it's, see, they were exposed, they were overrated, all this other stuff. And don't get it twisted. David Morrell, I have no problem with it. Try to keep your head up the best that you can. Try to use this as experience. But just in my personal view, I don't know if I ever see David Morrell becoming an elite level champion in boxing. I just don't know if I ever see it. He just, in my view, does not have the multi-dimensional style in order to really beat people. And in all honesty, I don't know if his come forward style is really going to work against a certain amount of the boxers that he's going to try to instill it on. But we'll see.
Have a better game plan while sticking to it. You have to fight your fight. And I think Morrell learned that.
David Morrell did fight his fight. It's just that you did not know, once again, David Morrell's boxing character.
That lesson from this fight. So go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comments.
But that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that because, once again, AKHi TV and a certain amount of guys, they don't judge things off of depth. They just judge things off of a surface level comparison. And AKHi TV says that he needs to fight his fight. David Morrell did fight his fight. Once again, and I stated that heading into this fight, David Morrell is not a guy that is this slickster. He's just not. Many people like AKHi TV and Dante, they take a look at black fighters like from Cuba or from America, and they label them basically all within the same category. And that's why like they get surprised when certain guys like the Charlo brothers, when they have an upsetting or a disappointing performance against guys like a Brian Castano or, someone like a Juan, Montiel, is because they're not a Floyd Mayweather. They're not a Terrence Bud Crawford. Just because they come from the same area or just because, once again, they may look alike doesn't always mean that they have a similar style. So it is what it is. You have to base things or you have to judge things off of in-depth and a super deep analyzation. You can't just judge things off of one or two factors or off of, once again, a surface level comparison. You have to do an in-depth analyzation. And that's why certain people had no idea the type of fight that was going to happen in this fight because they thought that David Benavidez was just going to be the straightforward pressure fighter and that overall he was only going to have one answer and that David Morrell was going to have these multitude of answers and that, overall he was going to be the better defensive fighter with the quicker feet and blah, 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 all sort of stuff. And that's just not what was going to happen. He's not that fighter. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.